Good day, everyone, and welcome to Dr. Cross's monthly webinars. My name is Becca Clark, and I am the student recruiter for our online degree programs at Thunderbird. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Ted Cross, Clinical Assistant Professor and Academic Director for the Master of Applied Leadership and Management. Thank you, Dr. Cross.
Thanks, Becca. It's great to be with everyone today. I'm excited to talk a little bit more about the science of happiness in this follow-up session to our previous session we had on the science of happiness a couple months ago. I wanted to start out with a little story. A number of years ago, my wife and I were living in Philadelphia, and we had the chance to meet Martin Seligman, who is known as the father of positive psychology. Now, Martin Seligman previously was the president of the American Psychological Association, and he is credited with sort of starting this movement of positive psychology that we'll kind of talk about today. But what was really interesting in meeting him is that he was actually started off as someone who wasn't really interested in positivity as much. Sorry, I was reading one of the comments that just came in. And so what he originally started out as was someone who is a deficit thinker. What can we fix about people rather than how can we help them become better? He actually is a self-admitted curmudgeon, and he says the reason he got interested in positive psychology and the positive sides of things is that his young daughter said that he was a grouchy old man and he needed to change. And so he decided that he was going to start studying the good things about people. And he came up with this concept of positive psychology. And the definition of it is really that psychology is much bigger than just medicine. And so you see his quote here. It's not just about fixing unhealthy things. It's about education, work, marriage. It's even about sports. And he says, what I want to do is see psychologists working to help people build strengths in all these domains. So most of the time when you get on an airplane and you sit next to someone and they happen to tell you that they're a psychologist, you might be a little bit worried because you think maybe they're going to start analyzing you, or maybe they're going to start asking you questions or judging you or those kinds of things. And so Seligman says, look, psychology shouldn't just be about bringing people from -10 to 0, but people from -2 to +2 in their lives. And how can we actually do that? And how can we quantitatively look at what science can tell us about happiness, well-being, and meaning? Now, the one thing I want to say up front here is that happiness, well-being, and meaning go together, but they're distinct concepts. Happiness is referring, at least in the scientific sense, to the way we feel emotionally in any given moment. Well-being is a larger concept that encompasses happiness, but also includes concepts such as meaning, achievement, and purpose that we'll talk about here in a minute. And so what I don't want people to think is that by studying positive psychology or the science of happiness, that you'll automatically change from a curmudgeon like me into someone who is perennially happy, someone who is always happy and cheerful. The truth of the matter is that when we look at the scientific literature, that between 40 and 60% of our disposition is biological. We inherit that from our parents and our ancestors. And so we're not going to suddenly become a cheerful person just by studying these types of concepts, but we can affect the other half, the non-biological half, and enhance our lives to be better than we are in a sort of normal state. So this is exciting news because there are some things that we can change and there's some things we can't. Let's see what science says about the things that we can change to enhance our well-being and our happiness, but to make sure that we are looking at this from a perspective that we're not going to change from, someone who is like very, very depressed or something like that, that needs medical attention. We are not going to change those kinds of things overnight, but we can enhance our lives by understanding the science of some of the choices we can make. So here is Tal Ben-Shahar. He teaches positive psychology at Harvard, and he says, look, positive psychology is really about the attempt to scientifically study and quantify the best parts of human experience. And so Seligman went at first just studying happiness, that sort of affective feeling, that emotional feeling that we have of happiness. And he decided to move from happiness to well-being in a new model that he calls PERMA, which is more holistic than just studying the emotional part of happiness. He wanted to study more than that. And so he just developed this framework that encompasses positive emotions, engagement, positive relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. And so what Seligman is saying here is that usually when we talk about the science of happiness, we're only talking about P, positive emotions. But if we really want to have a well-rounded life and have more success with having well-being, we need to actually look at engagement, positive relationships and how those influence us, the role of meaning, and accomplishment or achievement. So one thing I like to get out of the way right at the beginning is people often ask me when I give these talks about happiness is, what's the relationship between money and happiness? And we know the old saying that money can't buy you happiness, but actually some recent studies are showing that up to a certain degree, money does affect our happiness. A Princeton University study recently revealed that relative to where you live, and there's an interesting map if you Google Huffington Post and happiness and map, you'll find the map on the right-hand side that shows how much money you need to make in any given state in the United States of America to quote unquote reach a certain threshold of happiness. So what these scientists found is that up to about $75,000 relative to where you live. So it might be $75,000 in Arizona or Texas, but it might be a lot more than that in New York City, for example. But relatively, if you can make $75,000 a year up to that point, the amount of money you make does affect how happy you are. In other words, from 0 to 75,000, scientists can see that there's a correlation between the way people rate their happiness and how much money they make. But once you reach 75,000, you top out, and over 75,000, there is no more correlation between how much money you make and happiness. So there seems to be some sort of threshold relative to where you live in the world. In other places, it might be less, it might be more. But there is a threshold there that basically says if you can meet your basic needs and have a semi-comfortable life, it will affect your emotional happiness. Now, the interesting thing is that they also looked at what they call life satisfaction, meaning when they ask people, hey, how satisfied are you with your own life? Past $75,000 a year, life satisfaction increased with the amount of money people made. So in other words, where happiness stops at a relative threshold of 75,000, life satisfaction continues to increase. Now, this might happen because of the last letter here in Seligman's framework, which is accomplishment. People might be seeing money or quantifying earning more money beyond the threshold as an accomplishment, or they might find it a way to be really engaged with their work. And so that might be some reasons why life satisfaction continues to rise with income where happiness does not. Another thing I like to mention about money and happiness is that a lot of the studies are now showing that it's not just how much money you have, it's actually how you spend the money that you do have. And many experiments are showing that experiences are more important than accumulating stuff. In other words, it's better for me to actually spend my money on experiences than it is to buy material goods over and over again. And one sort of example I have from my own life is on the right-hand side of your screen. I remember that a number of years ago, my cousin was lucky enough, he got some tickets to the Jimmy Fallon show when they were here in town in Phoenix, and he invited my wife and I to go with him and his wife. And we had a really good time, and I always remember that experience. Now, the money that was spent was on creating a memory rather than accumulating some other material good. So many of us might feel like that maybe we feel happier if we go to the mall or go somewhere and buy some different things. And that's true. There's a little bit of bump of adrenaline that makes you feel good for a minute, but then overall it doesn't enhance our lives or increase our happiness. And scientists call this effect of buying stuff over experiences the hedonic treadmill. So many of us have experienced this. Imagine that you're walking on a treadmill, and sometimes in our minds what we tell ourselves is, I'll be happy once I get to X, or once I buy this thing, or once I have this relationship fixed, or whatever. And that continues to be a hedonic treadmill because we're seeking after sort of the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And once we get to our first goal, we are still walking on a treadmill and we're not making any progress. We're just going for the next thing and the next thing after that. And so it's not that we can't find pleasure and some positive emotions in buying some things or spending our money in certain ways. It's just that if we want to maximize our happiness, it's better to spend on experiences. In fact, there's some studies that are showing recently that if you want to maximize your happiness in travel, it's better to take many small, short vacations rather than a few long vacations. And that's because the scientists are finding that the real pleasure in going on vacation, half of it is anticipating and planning the experience, and then going on it and then being able to repeat that as frequently as possible is often more helpful than storing up and waiting for a really big trip and then staying on vacation for a long time. Now, I want to get to the R in the PERMA model, relationships. And here on the right-hand side of your screen, this is Timothy Wilson from the University of Virginia. He is a personality psychologist, and he also studies human relationships and interactions. And he notes that the number one predictor of how happy people are is the quality of their social relationships. So social relationships matter a lot. If you ask a lot of these positive psychologists, one piece of advice they would give people to increase their happiness now, there is really two things they would say, actually, rather than one. First, they would say, make sure that you are creating time to spend time with other people, friends, family, and cultivating relationships. And second, go do something else. Go do something for someone else, right? Do an act of service or some kindness, and that will increase your happiness right away. Now, one of the reasons probably that the number one predictor of happiness in people is the quality of social relationships is that we make meaning in groups. So we can create meaning when we're together in groups. We can explain things. We can feel like we fit in. We can have social support. We're also influenced by each other. So hopefully we choose a positive group to be part of that will influence us towards some of our life goals. And we can be positively influenced by positive peer pressure, by those things that, for example, I often sort of poke fun sometimes at my friends who do a lot of CrossFit. That is a positive peer pressure culture where everyone is coming together at CrossFit. This is these gyms where everyone gets together to do group exercise, mostly weightlifting. And so together they are positively influencing each other to come back to that gym over and over again because they're part of a community that is working towards a certain goal. Also, relationships are important for how long we live. On the right-hand side, this is a researcher who was on a recent TED Talk who's explaining a study that was done that showed Basically the study said, let's survey a bunch of people, let's wait 10 years and see if we do another survey, who's still alive after 10 years. So they did one survey asking people about their lifestyle and the things and their behaviors. And then they waited 10 years and then they wanted to see who was still alive and what things were predictive of who was still alive in that study. And what they found is that, and you might not be able to see it on the left-hand side of your screen, but the top predictor of whether or not you were alive after 10 years was social integration. Social integration means when you go to the pharmacy, do you know the pharmacist? Do you talk to the people at the front desk of the stores you go to? Do you have a church group or some community group that you go to? Are you socially integrated into your community? That was the number one predictor of longevity. And the second one is close relationships. So if you have good close relationships, you're more likely to be alive at 10 years from now. And what I thought was most interesting about this study is that social integration and close relationships outrank in predicting longevity smoking, drinking, flu vaccinations, and cardiac rehab and exercise. So if you want to be alive in 10 years from now, the top two things to do is to make sure you're integrated into your community, and second, to tend to the quality of your close relationships. This was borne out in another study by National Geographic called the Blue Zone Study, and that's what this scary Venn diagram on the right-hand side is. They were looking for places in the world that had the most people who lived to be over 100 years old. And they found that Sardinia, Italy, Okinawa, Japan, and Loma Linda, California in the US are three places that have the largest number of centenarians, people who live over 100 years. Then they want to find out, well, what kinds of things are they doing? What commonalities can we find across these different groups of people that seem to make them live longer? And you can see in the middle of the Venn diagram that family is one of the top ones. So that's a close relationship predictor. Not smoking. They often have plant-based diets. Constant moderate physical activity. So these people actually don't go to the gym, but they're lifestyle is a walking lifestyle, it's an active lifestyle, it might be a farming lifestyle. And then social engagement, right? So they are socially engaged in their communities. So you see some similarities here, and the point I'm trying to make is that social relationships are not just important for effective happiness and how we feel, but also affect our health and our longevity. Now, I'm pausing for my commercial here in the middle. If you're interested in these kinds of topics, you'll probably be interested in our online Master of Applied Leadership and Management. It's a 30-credit specialized master's degree focused on applied leadership and management. We deliver it in an online format with optional in-person experiences. And we try to have a reasonable price point for people in the US and Canada, and we have a scholarship available for students who live in emerging market countries such as India, Mexico, Brazil, and others. Please contact Becca or I if you have any questions about the program. Now, I wanted to continue on and dig a little bit deeper into what can increase our happiness and well-being, and focus in on a couple aspects of the PERMA model. Now, on the left-hand side of your screen, I have a picture of a bottle of aspirin, and that's because I want to sort of explain the concept of minimum effective dose. So if I have a headache, I can take 2 aspirin and wait 30 minutes and I'll probably feel better. And if I continue to take more aspirin and more aspirin and more aspirin, it doesn't make my headache better and better and better. It actually can have detrimental effects. It can make me sick. So in medicine, they often talk about the minimum effective dose. What's the minimum amount of medicine that I can take that will actually give the maximum amount of pain relief, in this case for aspirin? And so I'm very interested on what's the minimum amount of whatever that I can do to become more happy, to have better well-being. And if someone were to ask me, okay, this PERMA model is pretty complex. It has positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. If I were to give you a sort of 80-20 model, that is, what's the 20% that I could focus on that would get me 80% of the results, I would say focus on relationships and meaning. And those will help probably spill over into others. And the reason I say that is that if you work on positive relationships, you're probably going to have positive emotions because we do things together. Relationships also, like I mentioned, we make meaning in groups. If you're in certain types of relationships or social contexts, like I mentioned with the workout group before, you might feel a sense of accomplishment. If you are working on meaning, you're probably going to be pretty engaged, for example, at work if you find your work meaningful, and you also might find accomplishment and have positive emotions. So I would say that these are the two, what I would call kingpin areas of increasing your well-being and happiness. Let's talk about meaning. We already talked about relationships. Meaning really has 4 general parts, and this comes from Emily Smith. It's a great book called The Power of Meaning if you'd like to check it out. And she really decided to parse what makes up the concept of meaning. And she says, look, the first thing is that you need to have a sense of belonging. And again, this is a sense of belonging in the relationship sense to the community or a community. And so you need to feel like you fit in somewhere. Now, these can be communities that you're born into. These can be communities that you choose. These can be religious communities. These can be social communities. These could be political communities. These could be fitness communities. So you need to choose a community and make sure that you have a sense of belonging. Second, you need to have a sense of purpose. And what she means by purpose is that you need to feel that you are putting your talents and strengths to work for something greater than yourself. So purpose is putting your talents and strengths to work in service to something greater than yourself. So do you feel purposeful? And that could be in work, that could be in your service, that could be in other areas of your life. Third, she says we need to have a sense of story. And what she means is not that we need to read stories, but rather we need to have a personal story or mythos, a story of our own. What is our story? Are we clear on where we've come from, where we're headed, and how those things connect? And fourth, we need to cultivate a sense of transcendence. And what she's meaning by this is a somewhat spiritual kind of feeling. There is another positive psychologist named Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, and he wrote a book called Flow. And his whole concept of flow is sort of, if you've ever been playing sports or working and you've gotten into what we call the zone, where you've lost track of time because you're so focused, that's what he calls flow. And transcendence really is being able to find activities that get you into the zone where you lose track of self and time because you're so engrossed and you've transcended yourself and you're working on something important, fun, or meaningful to you. Now, let me go a little bit deeper into the story aspect. What do I mean by stories? Now, what I really mean is that we are our own stories. So here's a theorist on the right-hand side of your screen who says, autobiography is not merely something we read in a book, rather as a discourse of identity delivered bit by bit in the stories we tell about ourselves day in and day out. Autobiography structures our living. So what Eakins is getting at here is that our identity is often created by and large by the way we interpret the events in our lives and how we tell the story of that to ourselves and to others. So we are structuring our lives by the way we are crafting the story. So we really are our stories. We are the stories we tell ourselves. We are the stories that we tell others. Sometimes, unfortunately, we become the stories that other people tell us about ourselves and then we internalize those. But one of the reasons, for example, that talk therapy has been proven effective for people who are struggling with depression and anxiety, for example, is because it's helping people edit their stories through talking it out and making sense of things. Let me give you an example. Here's a pop image, I guess it's pop art, kind of reminiscent of pop art, of Steve Jobs. And Steve Jobs, a number of years ago, had a great speech at Stanford that he gave at their graduation ceremony. And he tells a number of stories about his life and the lessons that he learned. And one story he tells is about how he went to Reed College because he was an adopted kid, and his birth parents made his adopted parents promise that he would go to college. So he picked Reed College. It's a liberal arts college. It was very expensive. He explains that family really couldn't afford to send him there, but he wanted to go there. And I think within the first year, he decides to drop out of college. And he says he starts dropping into any class that he decides that he likes or finds interesting. And so he decides to drop in, just walk into a class and pretend like he's one of the students, even though he's dropped out of college, to a calligraphy class, one of these fine writing courses that teaches you about typography and stylistic elements of writing. And he really enjoyed that class. And he notes in his story to Stanford graduates that if he had not dropped out of college and dropped into that calligraphy class, the Macintosh computer or any computers probably wouldn't have the beautiful typography that they now have today. So he is making sense of the events that have happened in his life, looking backwards and connecting disparate events in a common theme. So what Steve Jobs is saying is, look, yes, I went to a calligraphy class, and now looking back, I see how that influenced my ability to create beautiful typefaces for Macintosh computers years later. But what he's doing is he's exercising the creation of his own narrative into a cohesive storyline that makes sense to him and that he can explain to others. And what this cohesive storyline does is creates a cohesive identity for Steve Jobs. This increases the meaning that he finds in his life as he moves along, because he's able to tie together things that might not seem to have meaning or have made sense at the beginning into one sort of cohesive whole. Another story I wanted to mention is there's a study a number of years ago on zookeepers by Thompson and Bunderson, a couple of researchers. They were very curious about zookeepers because zookeepers they have an interesting job, right? It's dirty, it's smelly sometimes. They don't get paid that much money, and sometimes they work in hazardous conditions. Yet, when the researchers looked at openings for zookeepers around the United States, they found that there was not very many openings to become a zookeeper. And when there were openings to become a zookeeper, there was a line of applicants. So lots and lots of people were applying to be zookeepers. There wasn't very many openings. And the researchers were curious because they don't get paid much and they have these harsh working conditions. So they started interviewing people who are zookeepers to find out, why do people want to do this? And what they discovered is that zookeepers don't view their work as a job. They view their work as a calling. In other words, they don't frame it as, I have to clean up after animals. They view their job as, I am helping keep animals. I might be working on endangered species or something like that. And they frame their work in a way that is very meaningful and purposeful for them. And so this sense of calling, the way they interpret their work, the way they tell the story to themselves, is helping create greater meaning in their work life. We can also do this. Wanted to end up with one more study by Dan Ariely. And this was an interesting study where they asked participants to make robots out of Legos. And let me explain to you some details of the study. They had a couple different groups. They were all asked to build Lego type robots. And they paid them $2 for the first one they made. And then they asked them, hey, do you want to build another Lego robot? And if they said yes, then they paid them $1.89. And then if they made that robot, they would say, do you want to make another one? And they pay them a little less, right? So the amount of money they're getting paid to make a robot, each subsequent robot, is going down. And so the researchers wanted to know, when would people like just stop making robots? Like at what point would people say, I've made 5 robots and the price is going down for each one that I make, so I'm going to stop? That's what the researchers wanted to find out. However, what the researchers did is they assigned the participants to either one of 2 groups. The first group they called the meaningful group. And so as the people built a Lego robot, they would be asked, do you want to build another one for $1.89? And they would say yes. And they would take their robot and place it on the desk in front of them, give them a new box of Legos, and they would build another one. And they would keep doing that and placing the robots they had completed on the desk in front of them. So that was the condition A. Condition B was they would ask them to build robots, and they would give them the same pay scheme, but rather than putting them in front of them on the desk, they would say, do you want to build another robot? And the participant would say yes. And they'd say, okay, we'll pay you $1.89. They would take the robot that the person just built, take it apart, and give them back the broken up pieces and say, okay, build another robot. And they would do that over and over again. So in one condition, the participants are getting to build lots of robots and put them in front of themselves on the desk. And the second condition, people are building robots over and over again, but someone's taking apart the robot they just finished and giving it back to them to build again. So what they found is that in the meaningful condition, where they got to keep the robots that they built in front of them, the participants built on average 11 robots, 10.6 robots, and they earned $14.40. In the non-meaningful group, the group where they were taking apart the robots in front of the participant and giving it back to them to build again, they only built 7.2 robots on average and only earned $11.52 or $11.52 for their work. Now, the interesting thing is this last bullet point is it's the same work, right? Like they're building robots, but the difference was in one condition, someone was destroying the work they had just done. And in the other condition, they were able to see their accomplishments as they went. The researchers hypothesized that meaning is the pivotal concept that is influencing these participants. In one case, they're able to make meaning and have meaningful progress as they see their work. And in the other condition, their work is being undone and they're not feeling meaningful at all. When participants feel that their work is meaningful, in this experiment at least, they are building more robots. Now, you might have felt the same thing in your own organizations. The more meaningful that you or your employees feel about the work you're doing, the more likely you are to be productive. You might have had a boss that wasn't so good, and it felt like they were taking apart your Lego robots that you just made right before your eyes, and that's very demotivating, and it makes your work unmeaningful. And it also goes to undercut that sense of accomplishment that we often have. And so to create meaning, I think it's important to remember that accomplishment is a part of it, and so is that social relationship components that we've talked about throughout the presentation. So if I were to give you a definition of what I believe is a good way to think of happiness and well-being, I would say that purpose peppered with pleasure is a good goal. In other words, rather than seeking after sort of the things that will make you feel happy right now, that increases just your emotional happiness, which is pleasure, let's flip the script and let's focus on purpose and meaning and try to pepper that with interdispersed pleasure. It's okay to seek after some pleasure, but don't solely seek after that. That's the hedonist path, right? Let's seek purpose and meaning, and let's intersperse that with pleasure. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today. I'd be glad to answer any questions. I do have a reading list here for us. We will make this this presentation available, and we'll send it out to all the participants who have signed up. And Becca, I turn over to you for any questions.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Cross. We have a question, and if everybody would please post your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. And we already have one to start out with from Arjun. Can you talk a bit about the way social media affects elements such as belonging and story? Belonging in terms of being part of a physical community or an online community, and the whole debate of whether social media brings us closer or apart. And a story with how social media presence creates the story we want to build, but is not really the story of who we are integrally.
It's a great question. There's a lot of new studies coming out about social media and its effects on our happiness and well-being. One of the things that a lot of studies have found is that people who use, for example, Facebook or other social media outlets tend to be actually more depressed than those who use it less. Now, when you dig into the data, though, it's not just that Facebook is negative or social media inherently is negative. It's the way that you use social media. So if you're using social media to sort of create this faux or fake perfect life, self-reflective, self-congratulatory sort of storyline that you mentioned in your question, then you're going to be less happy because it creates two things. Excuse me. One, you're self-focused. Two, you are actually probably becoming more disconnected because in presenting a faux self, you're not being authentic. And so what they found digging further into the research is that if you really want to increase your well-being, you can become part of social groups virtually that can be very positive if you're going onto those sites to really connect with people rather than to show off, right? Oftentimes the point of social media in modernity is to show off, as I mentioned. And so if you're going on there to actually connect with people, have conversations with others, I'm not talking about like arguing about politics or whatever, but if you're connecting with others and you're using social media as a true connection tool, then it can increase happiness and well-being. But if you're using it just to create sort of this faux self, then it's problematic. To the second part of your question about creating your own personal identity narrative, one of the problems we're finding is that if you're using social media to show off, you're only showing often the very best parts or the filtered, on Instagram it's #no filter, even though it's a filter, right? So, right now I have a beautiful light in front of me that makes my face look better as I'm on this video and all those things. But I don't look as good as I do on camera in real life. And so that creates a disconnect for ourselves because we know we can never live up to that. And it also makes us feel more depressed sometimes as we look at other people's posts because they're presenting a quote unquote perfect life. And we feel like we can't live up to that. So what I encourage people to do is don't be negative on social media, but be a little more authentic. And if you can be more authentic, it can help you sort of create that personal narrative and capture the timeline of life events.
Michaela asks, how can leaders benefit from and apply the science of happiness at work or with their followers?
It's a great question. There's a great new sort of field called positive organizational psychology or positive organizational scholarship. And what this is showing is that you can apply some of these principles into organizations. I think, for example, in the workplace, helping our followers, if you're a leader or a manager, have a sense of purpose in their work is very important. How can you actually do that? One, do you have a true authentic vision for what you're trying to accomplish? Does that help people have meaning and purpose? Are they working towards something bigger than themselves? Are we reinforcing that vision on a daily and weekly basis? And last, even if we think that a job is mundane, for example, there's a famous story, I think it's from Martin Seligman. He was studying some people at at a hospital, and he found a lady who was mopping the floors late at night, and she was very productive, and he was interviewing her, and he said, "How can you be so happy when your job is just to mop floors?" And she said, "I don't just mop floors, I'm helping people get well." And so she had reframed her sort of mundane job into a meaningful connection to a greater purpose. If we can help our employees do that at work, there's tons of studies and research that shows that they'll be more engaged and more productive. The other thing that I would mention is that it's important to sort of check in with people and see how their well-being is. Is there ways that we can build in flexibility so people can have more well-being? Are we cultivating a sense of community at the workplace? Like, I've always been one of these people who hates team builders. I didn't like to go, bowling together or do the pizza party or whatever. But the more research I do and the longer I work in organizations, I find how important it is for people to connect with one another. There's a study from an HR body, accrediting body, that showed that one of the number one predictors of whether or not people quit their jobs is whether or not they have a quote unquote best friend at work. So are people connecting with each other? That's two ways you can think about applying some of these principles in the organizational settings.
Nina asks, is there a threshold of income where people become less happy?
So I haven't looked at any of the studies that show like, is there an upper band where things start to go the other way? That could be very possible. I don't know the answer to that. Many of us might know people who are extremely wealthy and terribly unhappy. Oftentimes that has to do with the way that we're spending money and what we're doing with money. And also, if we become extremely wealthy, sometimes we become targets for other people to try to get money from us. But I think that one of the big aspects is learning how to be charitable, how to engage in charitable activities. If our income tends to increase more than we expect, or we're gaining lots of wealth, it's important to think about how we're actually spending our money.
A question from Catherine. Can you share your thoughts of where gratitude comes into the play for maintaining people's feelings of happiness?
So gratitude is a semi-controversial topic inside the world of positive psychology. I think it's certainly good to practice gratitude. One thing that will come up over and over again in the positive psychology literature is keeping a gratitude journal, and I actually do that on a daily basis. But what they found is that if you really look at the empirical evidence, maintaining a gratitude journal doesn't really increase happiness all that much. What they have found is that doing a different type of gratitude exercise does. Instead of writing down things that you're grateful for, the strongest intervention they found is writing down how happen chance the great things that have happened to you are. In other words, if I write down, that it was 1,000,000 to 1 that I met my wife, when I did, where we were, and I realized the role of fate, or how much I was not in control of that situation, but how grateful I am for that magic that happened. I am more likely to feel more grateful and happy than if I just list out things that I'm grateful for. And one of the reasons they think this is because we are attributing the things in our lives that we really value to fortune and things outside of our control, rather than just congratulating ourselves for having worked hard to earn all these lists of things we're grateful for. True gratitude comes out of the sense of knowing that we don't deserve what we've been given, and being able to recognize that through an exercise where we look at, hey, I was very lucky. Look at how lucky I am to have X, Y, or Z in my life.
A question from Anne. How do you balance avoiding the hedonic treadmill with still making goals and things to work toward in your personal and professional life?
So there's a couple of theorists who debate, goals versus no goals, and sort of this idea of the hedonic treadmill. I sort of fall on the side of make goals, but make fewer goals that are aligned with the overarching principles of happiness and well-being. And second, to think about where it's not appropriate to make goals in your life. I'm a type A person that loves to make checklists and lists and all kinds of things like that, and set all kinds of goals for different things. And what I find is that I often make too many goals and I overwhelm myself, and then I get demotivated to do those goals. So one of the best things I've started to learn to do is every couple months, look at my goal list and start eliminating goals, taking things off the list. But I think it's also important, if we haven't developed a habit, for example, in connecting with our community, to make that a goal for a while until it becomes a habit. That's one strategy to keep the balance, is that once something is positively ingrained as a habit, remove it from your goal list and forget about it, because it's become automatic and then it's not as overwhelming. And it's also often important just to have, like I said, 1 or 2 goals in each of the areas of your life. And also ask yourself, some places you just shouldn't have goals at all. It's too stressful, right? Maybe you've noticed that you work out less if you keep track of that. Maybe you've noticed that you're more stressed out if you're tracking, I don't know, your calories or something. Find out what works for you and do some experimenting.
Denise's question asks, very similar to that, is there any research on if simplifying things in your life can bring more happiness in your life?
So there's not as much research on eliminating or simplifying your life, but there is concepts out there in the literature about being more focused, right? And being able to focus on things that matter the most. That's the reason why I like looking through the lens of positive psychology. It's not, what do I think will make me happy? It's, here's some empirical evidence of things that we know that can increase happiness, well-being, or meaning. And so then I can focus through that lens of minimum effective dose on the things that will actually give me the biggest return on my investment. I think it's important to think of your life as sort of an investment of time. The studies on happiness show that at a certain point, like we mentioned, making more money doesn't make you happier, but having more time will. So if you spend your money to free up time, you'll actually be happier, because free time is very predictive of happiness. And so can you actually find ways that that you can use money or shift resources or energy to create free time and simplify your life in that way to a point where it increases free time? And so what the literature does say is that if you can find ways to simplify your life to create greater flexibility and free time, it will increase your happiness.
Ernestina asks, authenticity in our society is now defined based on individual understanding of self and majority. Can you comment on what standard we draw authenticity from to better maintain harmonious environment, considering the diverseness of understanding in our workplaces and world?
Yeah, that is an important distinction. I think that when we talk about authentic leadership or authenticity, there is a sort of American lens that is built into a lot of those assumptions. Many times what people present as authentic is them just being blunt and rude, right? And they'll say something blunt or rude and say, well, I'm just being authentic, I'm being myself. And that doesn't really help things that much. I think that the way we need to think about authenticity is, am I being transparent and congruent to my own value system? So first, have I defined my own personal value system? Am I acting in accordance with that value system? That's the first part of authenticity. And second, am I somewhat transparent but not preachy about my value system? So do people kind of know, well, Ted values X, Y, and Z, and that's why he acts in a certain way? And is that transparent enough for people to understand who I am? To me, that creates an authentic leadership style, if you will, where you are connected to your values and able to be transparent to your followers so they understand where you're coming from and where you stand on certain issues without defaulting to what I would call lazy authenticity, which is just being blunt and rude.
From Al, in your opinion, what is the difference between happiness and mere satisfaction?
So in the literature, like in the scientific literature, when they're talking about happiness, they're really talking about your emotional state at any given moment and how you feel, and in a positive emotion regard. And satisfaction is when you, especially from the aspect of life satisfaction, is looking at your life and evaluating, are you satisfied with how things have gone so far? And do you see a way to continue on that route going forward? And so satisfaction is more about, hey, do I feel like that I'm accomplishing some of the things that I want to do? Do I have maybe some of those relationships I want? And happiness really comes from the root word happenstance, which means, do I happen to feel good at this moment? And there are things we can do to increase those happenstances, but satisfaction is more about a long-term, enduring sense of contentment with your life.
How can these concepts be applied to those who want to be leaders or those who want to grow as a leader?
So I think that one of the most important things we can do as leaders or burgeoning leaders is to be self-reflexive enough to start to think about what is our own personal story, what is our own personal purpose that comes out of that story, and what is the value system that we have. If we can clarify that, we talk a lot about setting a vision in organizations and strategic planning and having a mission and strategic goals and those kinds of things. But what about our own selves? Do we have sort of that vision, that mission, that mythos, that cohesive leader story that conveys to our followers who we are and what we're about? In a sense, I believe that using positive psychology to get at our own personal meaning is the most important thing we can do to enhance our leadership effectiveness and communicate that to our followers.
Antonia asks, so a lot of what I've heard here is covered in Aristotle's Ethics. How is this different from Aristotle? And I don't mean the modern update.
Yeah. There isn't a lot of difference. What this is now doing is building off of ancient principles that Aristotle and perhaps Plato have brought up, and saying, now do we have science to help back up some of these things, some of these classical principles that we've had for thousands of years? Is there science that backs us up? What are the nuances of that? And how does it function in a modern world that is very different from ancient Greece, right? So there's some great books that actually examine positive psychology in reference to ancient Greek philosophy. Those are really good. I've learned a lot from those coming, a lot of these ideas are not new. What we're doing though is learning how to test them in a scientific way and then use that evidence to help convince people in business and organizations and academia to follow certain tenets of this. One of Martin Seligman's biggest goals through the positive psychology movement was to scientifically quantify virtues, which were described in Greek philosophy. But in modern times, how can we define and scientifically quantify some of those virtues that we have had for many years, but now we need to sort of make relevant or more palatable to a modern audience?
From Yannick, how do you sustain happiness in tough times?
So one thing I do want to make clear is that, like I said at the beginning, that you're not always going to feel happy. You're not always going to have the best well-being, and that's okay. The goal isn't to, like I said, change your disposition from a grouchy person that has inherited that sort of personality from their parents to someone who is always optimistic and bubbly. No, the goal is to have tools to be able to enhance where you're at and enhance your life. When tough times come about, one of the things to fall back on is this sense of community and relationships that help you pull through. So you don't have to be happy about the bad things that are happening in your life. Lots of bad stuff happened to us. But we can find meaning in that, in those hard things. I was giving another speech earlier this week, and I mentioned Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. He was a psychiatrist during World War II that was in a Nazi concentration camp, and he studied which people survived the concentration camps and which ones did not. And what he found was those that could find some sort of meaning in their suffering were able to survive. Even if that was just, he gives one example of a man whose son was in another concentration camp, and his purpose was to survive so he could see his son again. And so even in extreme circumstances, those people weren't experiencing effective or emotional happiness in large amounts or in a sustainable way. Of course they weren't. They shouldn't. But they were able to make some meaning out of some of the tough and terrible and atrocities they were going through. And in that way, we're able to sustain and live longer and persevere through obstacles.
Abe asks, would you please recommend a good book which talks about the science of happiness?
So let me go back to a couple slides here. Authentic Happiness by Martin Seligman is a really good one. That one gets a little bit deeper into his PERMA model. If you're just looking for a quick read that really hits the high level concepts, read Happier by Tal Ben-Shahar. So as it says here, he was teaching the most popular course at Harvard. And so he is a little bit easier to read, so you might start there.
Denise asks, what does having a strong faith play in happiness?
So one thing that we find is if people have some sort of religious framework or faith that they ascribe to, they often can have a greater sense of meaning because they have what we call a core narrative. So core narratives, and this you'll find in this book here, Redirect by Timothy Wilson. He talks a lot about how our worldview is often shaped by core narratives we have. A lot of those come from the way we were raised. Other core narratives come from religions or philosophical orders that we belong to. And those tend to help us make sense of the world and create meaning where there isn't often meaning if you don't have a framework for that. So other things that they found amongst people who tend to be more religious is they do tend to have a little bit longer longevity. And there is some evidence that some religious people tend to give more money to charities. There's some interesting work around that. But overall, it helps create a greater sense of meaning and purpose.
Lisa asks for any suggestions or resources to help find purpose or meaning in your life.
So take a look at some of these books here. We also have some interesting articles that we've written on personal purpose on the Thunderbird website. We can send that out along with this deck if you'd like. And there's some steps to go through that. We also will be running some sessions in the future. One of the things that we do inside the Master of Applied Leadership and Management program is there's a personal leadership class where we actually take people through the exercise of uncovering their personal purpose, defining it, and aligning their values and creating a sort of personal strategic plan, which is often very helpful.
Do we have time for a couple more questions?
Sure.
Okay. Going back to what you touched a bit on your personal story, how do you share your story if it started with many traumatic experiences, but you have managed to move forward?
Yeah, that's really...
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Share part of your story fully, but you want to share enough to let your clients know that you come from a place of compassion. This person is very happy these days, but he has his bad days of reliving some of those traumas.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that is extremely difficult for people who have not experienced trauma to understand. And so in my experience, what I've noticed is that if you if you've gone through a lot of traumatic experiences, you've probably habituated to trauma. In other words, that's your normal. Your experience, all of our experience becomes our own normal. And so if we overshare about our traumatic experiences, sometimes it shocks people, right? You might have had an experience where you talked about some really traumatic things, and the person you were talking to just had a blank stare because they couldn't relate because they hadn't gone through those types of experiences. But at the same time, you also don't want to sort of not tell anyone about those traumatic experiences. So if your own personal story includes lots of trauma, one thing I recommend is first, selectively find people that you can talk to about your full story. In the business setting, is there a way where you can sort of, maybe you don't give every traumatic event that's happened, but you explain a few of them in less detail and help people to gain empathy and show how it's shaped you? I think that's okay to do. I mean, you think of, like I was just talking about Viktor Frankl's story of being in a concentration camp. He is telling his story of suffering, but if we can find a way to do it that is not competitive in nature. So one thing that we as humans do a lot is we like to one up each other. So I know people who have experienced a lot of trauma in their life, and they're telling someone a story about a traumatic experience. Then the person across from them who has no traumatic experience tries to one up them with some trivial story, right? So that can be demotivating if you've gone through traumatic experiences. So what I recommend is first make sure that you're selectively revealing some of those tender traumatic experiences to people you trust, because that will help mitigate how people react to that. And second, if you're wanting to use it as a personal purpose to connect with clients or other workers or people in the workplace, I think it's fine to use those traumatic stories, to be honest about them, but you might want to select only a few and show how those have influenced to make you who you are today.
And our final question from Al: how is happiness measured? Is there some degree below or above which where happiness can turn into something else, either positive or negative?
So the most so one thing you all can check out is if you Google University of Pennsylvania happiness, it'll take you to Martin Seligman's website, and there's a ton of surveys. So a bunch of instruments on there that measure happiness, that measure grit, that measure all kinds of things. And mostly they're measuring happiness using self-reported data, using Likert scales where they ask questions and have you rate it 1 through 5. Is it super accurate? We don't know. It's the best that we can do. And so the way that they're measuring happiness and engagement and these kinds of things is they're using instruments that are normed and validated by these scientists and psychologists who study these constructs. And you can check out some of them on that University of Pennsylvania website.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Cross, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope you'll join us next month for Storytelling for Leaders, September 20th.
Thank you all. Have a great day.